This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by the Grim Hollow Monster Grimoire, which is just launched on Kickstarter.
Our friends at Ghostfire Games are releasing this book packed with over 300 new monsters for 5th edition.
Kelly and I love dark fantasy, and this book is offering an amazing bestiary of horrific creatures, abominations, and undead monstrosities inspired by your favorite tales of grim, dark, dreary monster tales.
Not only that, but this book is going to contain rules for how to harvest monster parts and the crazy items that you can make with those parts.
Also, the book is going to be packed with tons of great advice for dungeon masters on how to make the most of these monsters in your adventures and encounters.
You can follow the links below to join in on the Kickstarter now. And now, onto this week's episode.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for dungeon masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we're going to talk about how to avoid being an awful role player during your games of Dungeons & Dragons.
A lot of people have left comments about how role-playing can be a big challenge for them, or that they aren't sure exactly what it takes to role-play in general.
And some players have had problems with people who role-play in a disruptive manner that either makes other people at the table a little bit frustrated, or even makes the dungeon master frustrated because the players don't go on the adventure.
It also becomes really challenging when there are a lot of sources out there that are excellently role-played, live-streamed campaigns. There's a lot of campaigns that include voice actors or actors who can really add a lot of elements into role-playing that aren't necessary for your home games. And it sets a really high bar for those of us who are just getting into the hobby, thinking that we need to excel to that level.
Good role-playing means different things to everybody, but fundamentally, role-playing isn't about acting. Role-playing is about making interesting decisions as your character that create a unique scenario and ultimately tell a satisfying story. Good role-playing can include things like making awesome one-liners and funny quips, but just as often as that, good role-playing is about thinking about what your character would do in an interesting situation, and even making decisions that you, as a person that you are, wouldn't make, but would be the choices that the character would make in those circumstances.
The goal of role-playing is to create a lens in which you are viewing the world of Dungeons & Dragons through, the lens being your character that you've created. At the end of the day, this all comes down to understanding the motivations of your character, what it is that drives them towards the adventure, and why it is they are doing what they are doing. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
So first off, one important caveat, and we feel like a broken record every time we have to talk about this, but it's important. Dungeons & Dragons is a shared experience. You are playing this game with a dungeon master and a group of other players, which means that you have a responsibility to be part of that team and contribute to the engaging experience that everybody is having together.
You are playing as part of a team, but a lot of interesting stories can come from conflict, disagreement, and even friendly rivalry. But at the same time, while developing these stories and figuring out what direction your characters are going in, it's important to also hold true to the fact that this is a team game, and at the end of the day, you want to push forward with the adventure in a team setting.
Outright hostility should be something that you avoid. So when you are choosing traits for your character's personality and background, you want to avoid things that are going to cause antagonism between your characters. These are things that should typically be discussed during a session 0 while you are creating characters to make sure that everybody can play characters together that are going to work well. You might be part of one group where your group is okay with things like conflict between player characters, but other groups don't like this. So before you start thinking about playing that paladin who wants to slay every single spellcaster, you might want to think about what the party wizard thinks about that, or a rogue who's going to steal from everybody in sight. Well, again, your other party members probably aren't going to like you. At the end of the day, all the player characters in the party have to be able to work together somehow. If they don't trust each other and they don't like each other, it puts a lot of work on the dungeon master to figure out why all these people are going to be working together. So do your dungeon master a favor, and no matter what your character's personality is like, they should at least be able to be willing to cooperate with the other players.
Does your paladin agree with the rogue? Maybe not. But is what they're dealing with more important than their silly rivalry? Hopefully yes, and that allows them to push forward and figure things out.
With that important caveat out of the way, we want to address another misconception that has taken root within many Dungeons & Dragons communities, especially in the wake of high-profile livestream campaigns run by casts of professional actors, voice actors, and comedians. And that is about voice acting. This is not necessary to roleplay your character well. You can create an amazing, interesting, and fascinating character and still speak in your own everyday vernacular, and you don't have to adopt an accent or wear a costume or have funny mannerisms or even make one-liners or even speak in the first person. Role-playing is about making interesting decisions and choices, taking interesting actions. It's not about acting.
A lot of people look at these famous actors, comedians, and voice actors, and what they see on the surface are people doing funny voices and really excelling at the acting part of role-playing. And I will say that in the lessons of becoming an actor, you learn a lot of the core values that actually do attribute to role-playing. But they can take it to a level that they are professionals and they do this constantly, and they have a whole variety of voices to pull upon to bring their characters to life. But at the core of acting is finding out who the character is and what motivates them. And that is the truth about role-playing. You don't need to throw on a voice. You don't need to even be good at acting. As long as you can understand the motivation of your character, you can role-play that character.
If you are interested in doing things like an accent or adopting interesting mannerisms, one of the really wonderful things about studying acting is that you can achieve a lot with only a little. You can create characterization in your voice simply by changing the pitch of your voice or how fast or slow you're speaking. A person who's speaking very, very quickly, even in your normal voice, has a very different approach and characterization than a character who is speaking very slowly, even though you're speaking in your normal, everyday voice.
Simple modifications to your voice or even the way you position yourself at the table could be enough to bring your character to life. If your character is a little bit more laid back and ready for anything, you kind of just raise an eyebrow and lean back in your chair, and now when you're talking as your character, you have enough to go on to make them seem a little more whatever about the whole situation. Whereas if you take something like hunching your back and start talking a little bit faster, now you seem a little eccentric and maybe anxious. And simple things like this don't involve changing your voice, doing an accent, or really even changing that much about the way you're presenting yourself. You're taking your own voice and your own body and augmenting it in simple ways that suddenly change the character depiction at the table. And this can be really valuable, and now you know what to fall back onto when you're looking at your character and the way they are presented at the table.
Having a prop for your character can actually be a very powerful totem, almost like wearing a mask that helps you focus on their personality as well. If you have something like a pipe, or a pair of goggles, or glasses, or a book, maybe even a coin, or some sort of token that your character carries, perhaps even a stuffed animal to represent their familiar. That object could be a very powerful tool to just get you into character a little bit more. It's funny how all it takes sometimes is picking up a little bit of a piece of a costume and putting it on, and all of a sudden, the character just inhabits your body. It's kind of magical, so it might be worth trying sometime. Mimicry can also be powerful in this respect. If you have a favorite celebrity impression, just dive in. Sometimes just trying to speak like a very iconic celebrity can automatically transform your body and turn you into a character on its own. The most important thing about trying any of these things is making sure that everyone in your group feels secure enough to do them. Don't make fun of other players at your table for trying to do these things. That's not fair, and it really diminishes what happens at the game table when you do this. Be supportive and encouraging. Give some people inspiration, or maybe bring them a drink at the next game session to encourage them to do this, because it does add a lot to the gameplay experience.
If you are playing with people who do not dive into role-playing in the same way, and maybe they speak in a third-person perspective, as long as that person is saying, my character says this, or my character does this, and those choices and actions are through the lens of their character, they are still role-playing. And they shouldn't be shut down for not role-playing enough, and they shouldn't be told that they need to put on a voice or certain mannerisms. As long as they are playing the game as if they were the character and looking at things through that perspective, that's role-playing, baby. Another really important aspect of role-playing is that your character needs to be willing to seek adventure. Dungeon Masters put a lot of time into creating adventure hooks and reasons why your party is going to be going on this adventure. When those are presented, you need to jump on them and not say no.
Coming up with motivations for why the characters are going on this adventure is one of the hardest parts about being a Dungeon Master. And you can be an excellent player by role-playing your character in such a manner that when those adventure hooks are presented to you, you embrace them and you bite down hard on the hook. Whether your character is offering your characters magic items, the reward to do the right thing, gold, or even just a good rationale. Rather than being like, nah, that's not enough gold. Nah, that reward isn't good enough. Be excited and be excited by the adventure and talk about what the possibilities for your character could be, rather than immediately getting into this bargaining mode of like, why should I go on this adventure, Dungeon Master? Almost every Dungeon Master finds that kind of role-playing insanely frustrating. It's better avoided, and it just gets to the heart of the game faster and in a more constructive manner if your characters get excited about things.
Now, on the flip side of this, it is possible to play a character who is the reluctant adventurer, but they still participate in the adventure. My greatest example of this is Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit, who definitely wanted to stay home, smoke pipeweed, and eat cheese all day, but when presented with a great threat that was bigger than he was, and he realized that he was essential in taking part in this because he could do the right thing, he went running over the hilltop screaming, I'm going on an adventure. That might have been from the movie and not the book, but you get the idea. Bilbo Baggins is a great template for the reluctant adventurer because at no point in the adventure does he give up or does he say no. He continues to pursue the adventure willingly because it's the right thing to do. And if that's all the motivation you need, then use it. But even if you are going to play a character who maybe is scared or unwilling, the fact is that something has driven them on this adventure and something keeps them there. And it's up to you as a player to decide what that is, not the Dungeon Master. You need to say yes. You need to be willing to go on the adventure. Otherwise, there's no point in participating in a game of Dungeons and Dragons.
This is why focusing on your character's ideals, bonds, flaws, and personality traits is often much more important than focusing on their backstory and their personal motivations. When you can create a character that is motivated by a variety of different things, that makes them more open to embracing the variety of adventure hooks. It's possible your character is going to go on some adventures that aren't necessarily about them personally. So they still need a reason to go on that adventure, and by focusing on your character's personality traits, flaws, ideals, and bonds, you create this open-ended set of hooks that can draw your character into the adventure and still might lead to a personal connection to what is going on. I like to also make my characters care about another one of the player characters as well. So even if I'm not on the adventure for my own personal gain, I still care about Kelly's character and we still want to adventure together.
It could be just enough to say that you are the older sibling of one of the other adventurers who is keen to go on this adventure, and you consider your role to be to protect them. You don't want to go on the adventure, you don't want to be there, but you are going to give your life to protect your friend or sibling. And that's enough reason for you to be on this adventure as well.
If it comes down to it, and you really can't think of a reason why your character would go on this adventure, maybe you should consider playing a different one.
A simple concept to really drive home role-playing for your character is coming up with a simple quirk that you can rely on. This allows you to have something like a quote or a simple phrase or a list of things that you might be into that you can fall back on when you're looking for a way to roleplay your character. We've used quirks several times when creating our characters for our DRAKKENHEIM series. One of our characters, Veo, reliably fell back on the idea of relating everything to food and thinking with her stomach. These are a simple quirk, but they allowed her to easily roleplay. If she didn't have anything to say in a moment, she would make a food pun or talk about how hungry she was, and that was enough. Another character, Wilhelm, that I have played, has a list of rules that he lives by, and I'm looking for opportunities to bring those rules in. Another simple one is a phrase like, "What's the worst that could happen?" When I need to throw that out there to drive home who my character is, that simple phrase allowed me to portray my character and became a reliable source to show that I was role-playing. These sorts of things can really add a lot to your character and can be extremely simple if you just think of a fun way to bring your character to life that you can rely on time and time again.
If your character has a familiar, they might have some fun interactions of how they feed their familiar, or play with them, or chat with them, or have conversations with them. If your character follows a deity, maybe they have various prayers and axioms and sayings that they're constantly uttering, quoting from their holy book. Perhaps your character is very analytical and speaks with a certain mannerism and always uses extremely large and superfluous words in every single sentence that they happen to utter. These kind of things give you just a fun fallback that helps reinforce who your character is, doesn't really influence their decisions, but reminds the other players and the dungeon master and yourself who your character is.
This really actually leans into our next point, which is don't be afraid of tropes and cliches. There are a lot of tropes and cliches in the fantasy world, and I'm sure many of them have been used many, many times. But we have never seen your version of it. And when you bring it to the table, showcasing your version of a trope or a cliche is going to be what's exciting for you, and it's going to be unique because it's through your lens. This means that if you want to play the strong barbarian who is dumb and just wields an axe and makes stupid decisions and runs into battle, yeah, we've seen that a million times, but it's still going to be reliably fun at the table, and I'm sure everybody's going to have a blast playing with you. And if that's the trope that you like, then you're going to have a blast playing it.
Of course, if your character is always a elf ranger who dual wields scimitars, you might want to try branching out just a little bit. But if you do have favorite characters from fiction, fantasy, movies, video games, or books, you should draw inspiration from those and use that as a reliable fallback. You will always make your own permutation and inspiration and grab elements and bits and pieces. One of the things that I love doing when I create my own characters is I often make a list of 2 or 3 fantasy characters that I'm inspired by and kind of merge them together in a strange pastiche, augmenting certain elements of that character's personality or appearance or costume and combining them with elements from the other character's personality or motivations or goals. It's a great way to draw inspiration, create a character that is interesting and unique without having to do too much work in really coming up with a brand new idea. There's this idea in literary theory that there's really nothing new under the sun. But in a role-playing game, your specific characterization of those ideas in the circumstances that your dungeon master and your group plays them in are always going to create a unique result. So don't be afraid of these cliches because they're actually going to turn into something fun and unique once you bring them to the table.
If you're a person who struggles with role-playing and you have trouble with voices or mannerisms, then leaning onto a cliche trope or an existing character is a reliable way that you can bring a character to life. Just because you can't act, I'm sure you can do an impression of Batman. And so if you create a shadow monk who you're like, you know what, maybe this is just kind of my version of Batman, then you can play it like that and do your best Batman impression at the table, and you're going to have a fulfilling character. My favorite character I've ever played, Sebastian Crow, was very much based on my love for Constantine from the DC comic books and Doctor Who, specifically the 10th Doctor. So when you looked at Sebastian Crow at the outset of the campaign, he was these two characters mashed together. Through my role-playing and the events that happened, he became his own unique individual that I think is wholly separate from either of those two characters. But it allowed me to reliably fall back on the tropes and cliches that made those two characters stand out to me.
This brings us into the final point that we want to discuss today, which is allow your character to grow. People are not fixed, and across a person's life, they change, evolve, develop, their minds change, their habits change, and everything is always building upon their past experiences. Your character is not made of stone, unless they're an Earth Genocide or Goliath. But even then, the Earth itself even shifts and changes. And so there should always be opportunity for your character to develop.
Not to mention, the events that are usually taking place within a Dungeons & Dragons campaign are going to be life-changing. They're the kind of events and the kind of stories that do change a person. If you're looking at something like Lord of the Rings, Aragorn at the beginning of the movies or books is very different from Aragorn at the end of the movies or books, and he goes through a big change in who his character was. And don't be afraid of this. The purpose of a good story is to challenge the protagonists and what their beliefs, ideals, bonds, and flaws are. By challenging them, it's okay to imagine your character changing their outlook on the world around them. Perhaps the little town that they grew up in where everything was fine is not going to work when they realize that the world is much bigger and there are very epic things at stake here. These sorts of things are going to change their opinions on the world, and letting this happen is what's going to make fulfilling stories at the table.
Don't forget that when you create a character, their story has just begun. Don't put the most interesting thing that ever is going to happen to your character in their backstory, because the most interesting things in their life, the things that are going to change them, are still yet ahead of them. Those are things that you will explore in your adventures. Of course, every superhero has an origin story of some kind that can have important and life-changing events. But it's difficult to say whether the most important event in Batman's life was the death of his parents or his rivalry with the Joker. Heroes are changed by their adventures. Even those who are ruled by logic and reason sometimes fall to impulse and emotion. That's part of being human. And if your character isn't human, again, humanoid.
At the end of the day, role-playing is not about funny voices or being a professional actor. These can help, and if you do have those in your back pocket, great. But role-playing is about deciding what your character's purpose is in this story and making decisions and choices that are based on who the character is that you created. This could be done in any number of ways. You could talk about what your character says, thinks, and does. You could pretend you are your character. You could have different mannerisms, quirks, voices, and attributes that you bust out at the table. You could have goggles or a small stuffed animal. There are so many ways to bring your character to life, and deciding what you're most comfortable with, as long as you are making decisions based on the character you created, you are role-playing just fine. And people should appreciate that, respect that, and have fun with that with you at the table.
And of course, never forget that you are still playing a team game with other people, and be considerate with the other people at the table as you roleplay and create your character so that you can all have a wonderful time together.
So this has been a look at how to avoid terrible role-playing in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about some of your favorite tricks for role-playing in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our amazing Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube and would like to join our community, please follow the links in the description below to learn how you can support our work.
Also, our live play Dungeons of DRAKKENHEIM is coming to Kickstarter. We've partnered with Ghostfire Games to bring this campaign to life as a 5th edition module. You can follow the links below or go to DRAKKENHEIM.com to join the mailing list to make sure you're up to date on all the information regarding the upcoming Kickstarter. And don't forget to check out our live plays in the Worlds of DRAKKENHEIM, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we have plenty more tips and tricks for players in games of Dungeons & Dragons right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.